Koto, welcome to our Top Talks, and just a couple of announcements before we get down to business this week. We have coming up our next session is on September the 23rd, and we're going to be talking to the School Strike for Climate people about the climate strike that they have planned for that last week of September. So that'll be really fascinating, talking to some inspiring young activists in that sense. And then on October the 3rd, pretty soon after that, we have the launch of our new brand. So that's going to be at McKeown. So if you're in Wellington or anywhere near Wellington, come along to that. McKeown, 6 o'clock for a 6:30 start on October the 3rd. That's a Thursday night. So it'd be great to see you there. So this evening we are talking immigration with Michael Reddell. So big round of applause for Michael, folks. So Michael is an economic commentator with a long history here in Wellington. He's been a part of the Reserve Bank for many years and went on to do a stint at the IMF. Yep. IMF. I always get confused with the World Bank, but IMF, I got it right. And he's now a commentator, an economic commentator via his blog, Crook and Cassandra. So if you haven't checked that out, make sure you do. www.crookandcassandra.com. Yes, it is one of the few .com. So Michael, you're a Wellingtonian?
Not really.
No?
No,
Where are you from originally?
Cantabrian originally.
Cantabrian. Okay, well we won't hold that against you, but our Cantabrian viewers will like to hear that. But you've lived here for
40 years. So,
40 years now. Yeah. And you live Island Bay, is that right?
Yep.
Yeah. You got a few kids.
Wife and 3 kids, 3 teenage kids, and that's what occupies a lot of my time now as stay-at-home parent as well as the economic commentator stuff. So
awesome. Well, great to hear some gender role bashing in that respect, being the stay-at-home dad. And so, your history as an economist. How long were you at the Reserve Bank for?
Oh, about 30 years with various interruptions. I had a couple of secondments as economic advisor at the Central Bank in Papua New Guinea, Central Bank in Zambia, as Geoff said, on the board of the International Monetary Fund, representing New Zealand, and a couple of years at Treasury as well, which is where I got interested in these sorts of issues.
Nice. And I understand that your experience, your career has led to the creation of the naming of your blog, Crook and Cassandra, which I admit I didn't get the reference, but something to do with Keynes.
Yeah, John Maynard Keynes published a volume of essays in the 1930s, Essays on Persuasion. And in the foreword to that, he wrote that these were the croakings of a Cassandra who believed that he was right, but was never early enough in convincing anybody. And my last 5 years at the Reserve Bank, I'd been increasingly convinced that my analysis wasn't going anywhere, and I was looking for a blog title that was a bit obscure, that didn't feature Kiwi or New Zealand, and so latched onto that. I like to think I'm right. Hopefully it doesn't sound a bit quite as vain as it perhaps does. But.
No, I'm sure there's a lot of people who've worked in the public sector who feel that way. And so the topic of tonight really is immigration. And I want to say from the outset, this is a controversial topic, obviously. It's been controversial for a while, largely thanks to the dog whistles of one Winston Peters. And obviously with the terrible tragedy that happened in Christchurch, it's become an incredibly sensitive issue that no one really wants to talk about. But it is still an incredibly important area of policy, and in our view, nothing should be beyond a reasonable debate. So this session was really a way of contributing to that conversation. Michael's been working on immigration for a number of years now, over a decade.
Oh, roughly a decade, yeah.
Yeah. Yes. And maybe tell us how you first got interested in the issue.
Yeah, at the Reserve Bank, you don't really deal with issues like immigration much, except, did it go up last month or down the month before? But I was on secondment at the Treasury about 10 years ago, and one of the parts of the ACT National Coalition deal in 2008 was the setting up the 2025 task force, which was supposed to come up with a series of policy recommendations for closing the income gaps between New Zealand and Australia that have opened quite dramatically over the last 30 or 40 years. And I got involved because I'd worked for Don Brash for a long time. He was the chair of it, and I ended up heavily involved in providing them policy analysis and writing the report. And a lot of the report I ended up agreeing with, but I came away from it thinking these things aren't really large enough to explain the differences that we're dealing with. So Australia is roughly 45% wealthier than New Zealand. This is productivity or GDP per hour worked. And that led me on to looking more deeply at what are the explanations for why New Zealand has done so badly, not just relative to Australia, but relative to the entire advanced world. 100 years ago, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States were the richest countries in the world. We've been slowly getting worse, really for most of the period since then. And that was what led to the question, what's so different about New Zealand? What are the things that really mark us out that might begin to make a difference? And that was how I latched on to the question of immigration.
So that's really important as a kind of a backgrounder to this conversation. The context for this conversation is really this is all about how do we work smarter so that you can either earn more for every week that you work, or maybe you can take a day off. Yay, wouldn't that be great if we became more productive like Europe is, and a lot of Europeans choose, or through government regulation, work less than we do. So that that's the ultimately the goal of what we're talking about here. It's nothing to do with race or ethnicity or anything like that. This is purely about how do we actually get New Zealand's economy working better? How do we make the boat go faster?
Yeah, absolutely. And to take that comment, the reference Geoff's making to European countries, there's a tier of top performing European economies: France, Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Austria, Denmark, and one other, Sweden, I think, who on average have productivity levels that are 60% higher than those in New Zealand. We would have to lift our economic performance 60% to match them. And this is not about working harder, it's about utilising resources and people more effectively and more efficiently to give us those living standards opportunities. They're really big challenges. And so small policies will often be useful, but they're unlikely to be the sort of thing that will make those sorts of changes. And that's one of the differences about immigration, is that New Zealand has had, particularly for the last 25 years, the highest rates of immigration, non-citizen immigration per capita of any country in the advanced world.
So by non-citizen you mean you're not including Kiwis returning from Australia, because
that's right.
We shouldn't be counting those. They're
not a matter of policy at all, that sort of thing. So what I'm focused on is what contribution does policy make? And for the last 20 years or so, we've been targeting around 45 to 50,000 people to get residence permits every single year. So that was just over 1% of the population on average through that time. In the US, Trump, whatever, has been campaigning on immigration there. He's been trying to look to reduce it. Immigration per capita in the US is 1/3 of what it is in New Zealand. In Britain, immigration's been part of the Brexit debate. Immigration per capita there is about 1/3 of what it is in New Zealand. Even in Australia and Canada, which are also relatively high immigration countries, the amounts that they're targeting are lower than we've been setting out to bring in New Zealand. The only country in the OECD that has anything like our experience is Israel, and it's a completely different sort of environment because, as you'll be aware, in Israel they have a policy, the law of return. Anyone of Jewish ancestry is entitled to come back and claim Israeli citizenship as of right. And of course they have defence and foreign policy considerations that are relevant. It's not an economic motivation primarily. Whereas immigration policy here, successive governments have sold it as a tool of economic policy. The line that used to come out of MB repeatedly was a critical economic enabler. And my story essentially has been, it might have looked like a reasonable argument when we started this in the early 1990s. The evidence just isn't there that it's worked. If anything, the evidence suggests that we've been making New Zealanders as a whole worse off. The foreigners who come benefit as a result, and as Geoff says, this is not anything about ethnicities. It's also not anything about criticising the immigrants. The immigrants are pursuing the best interests of themselves and their families. But policy making in New Zealand should be made first and foremost in the interests of New Zealanders. And my argument is that in the specific circumstances we find ourselves in, this really remote country where economic opportunities just don't abound, it's not been a sensible policy. It's been deeply counterproductive.
So we've been targeting, I don't think a lot of people know this, we've been targeting residency increases each year of about 1% of our population.
That's right.
40 to 50,000, I think
Yes.
you said, yeah. So that's been a target, not a matter of how many people are knocking on our doors. If we get a lean year, we're actually altering our policies to try to encourage more people to come.
That's right. I mean, it's one of the good things about New Zealand in a way is that we don't have problems with illegal migration to any great extent. Migrants come because we choose to allow them to. There's a small number of overstayers, people overstay their visas, but the issues are just totally different from those, say, the US faces around its southern border. This has been a matter of deliberate and conscious public policy. And most importantly, perhaps, a policy that as it's gone on now for 20, 25 years has not been supported by the sort of robust evaluation that would suggest that there are economic benefits churning in for New Zealanders. The sort of arguments that have been run by people over the years have been that bringing in lots of migrants will encourage export industries. Well, exports as a share of GDP in New Zealand are very low by OECD standards. More importantly, they've been falling for the last 15 or 20 years. It's become an increasingly inward-oriented economy. And so Andrew Coleman, who I think you had here a couple of sessions ago, describes the economy of Auckland as essentially an economy that's devoted to building Auckland. And Andrew's not, broadly speaking, wrong. You look at the Auckland economy and you say, where are the outward-oriented, export-oriented businesses that are based in Auckland? Fonterra, of course, has the head office there, but I mean, Fonterra is really just the funneling house for stuff that goes on in the provinces. We just haven't been able to build those city-based industries, and yet we keep growing those cities, particularly Auckland.
Wellington's different though, right? Because we've got Weta, which is not government subsidised at all. Anyway, zero is
the success story. But
yeah, that's right.
To the extent they stay.
Yeah. So the argument was that bringing in labour would build exports, would build our skill base, particularly build our skill base without having to pay for that education, because we're bringing in people already with skills.
And I mean, there's something to that in the sense that obviously the people who come, we haven't paid for their education. Of course, we're paying for the education for their children who are New Zealanders. But perhaps the bigger issue is that the average immigrant that we're bringing in is not more skilled than the average New Zealander. In fact, OECD data that actually the previous government highlighted when it came out, New Zealand had among the most highly skilled native-born New Zealanders of any OECD country. I think we were matching Sweden and Finland from memory with the two countries. Our migrants are more highly skilled than migrants to most OECD countries, and part of that's because we have the rules. We don't have the illegal migration taking place. But they're not more skilled than the New Zealanders. And in fact, what the data has shown is that a surprising number of the migrants who've come have been for the sort of occupations that nobody really thinks of as advanced skills. There's huge numbers of retail managers, cafe managers, rest home assistants and nurses, dairy farm workers, and a sort of list that runs through there. And you have to get down to about occupation number 20 on the list before you start saying, oh yeah, that's a recognisably highly skilled occupation. You can really imagine that we're benefiting from bringing these people in. So, what the evidence tends to suggest is that the immigrants are benefiting. That's good for them and their families. I've got no argument with them. But it's not benefiting the people that it was setting out to benefit, which is New Zealanders.
So, I mean, if it's benefiting the immigrants and it's not benefiting us, but it's not really hurting us, then we're doing a good thing for the world, right? But I think your suggestion is that it may actually be detrimental to our development as well.
That's right, and part of that brings it to the sort of second stage of my story, which is that New Zealand, being such a remote economy, has always largely been built on its natural resources. I mean, we all know this. What does New Zealand export? We export forestry and meat and wool and dairy products. We actually export tourism, which is also a natural resource, because nobody comes to New Zealand to see our fantastic architecture or art. They come for the natural resource, the physical environment of New Zealand. I estimate that probably only 15% of our exports are based on anything other than natural resources, and even some of those, export education notably, are effectively subsidised by being tied in with the immigration system. So what we've got is an economy that's built on natural resources, that looks as though it probably always will be built on natural resources. People have been talking for 50 years in New Zealand about gravitating away from a reliance on natural resources, and it just hasn't happened. The composition of what we export has changed, with more dairy, more wine, less meat, less wool, a bit more tourism, but we haven't managed that transition away from it. And my argument's been sort of twofold, really. One is that if you've got a fixed volume of natural resources and a lot more people, then simply put, you're dividing nature's bounty across a lot more people, and the amount that's available per capita diminishes automatically. You can think of Norway, for example. Norway has about 2/3 of the oil in the North Sea. Britain has about 1/3. But because Norway is a country of 5 million people, they're at the top of the OECD league tables. An astonishingly wealthy country. Britain, with 1/3 of it, 65 million people, is well down in the second tier of OECD economies.
I think we talked about Iceland as well, which actually has an explicit policy of trying to maintain its population because it has abundant cod resources, and they don't want any more people because they'd have to share the cod.
Yeah. I mean, cod and aluminium electricity exports is the Icelandic economy, and it's created a very productive, very wealthy society, and that's what we've largely, increasingly failed to do.
And I think, so it's the proposition, that's quite a simple one. We've got a certain amount of natural resources, we increase the number of people, therefore our prosperity is natural resources divided by number of people, therefore we're worse off. I've also seen you discuss, well, okay, that would be okay if we were then building up our capital in other ways, but potentially immigration is hampering us there as well.
Yes, and so, as I said, the business of the Auckland economy is building Auckland. What happens when migrants come in? Understandably, they want a house just like you or I do. They need a factory, their kids need schools, they need hospitals and roads. So there's big infrastructure demands that are put on the economy. And those big infrastructure demands, all else equal, put upward pressure on interest rates, and they put upward pressure on the exchange rate. So for the last 30 years, even though our interest rates are very low now, they still are among the highest anywhere in the advanced world. When interest rates are high, firms' hurdle rates of return that they're considering when they're considering new investments are higher than otherwise. Not so much business investment occurs. Business investment as a share of the economy has been lower here than in almost every OECD country in the last 50 years, even though we've had probably the 5th fastest population growth rate in the OECD during that time. A high interest rate has put pressure on the exchange rate. For the last 20 years, our exchange rate has been fluctuating around pretty high levels. That makes your overseas holiday, my Amazon book purchases, a whole lot cheaper, but it also means that industries that are based here it's that much harder to get established. If you're considering basing here and the exchange rate's 25% higher than it probably should be, you've got to have an astonishingly good business for that to be viable. And what we actually see is firms, I mean, even Xero is a good example, right? It's been set up based here in Wellington. Most likely in 10 years' time, very little of it will be based in Wellington or in New Zealand. That's been the story of so many technology firms, so many manufacturing firms in New Zealand in the last 30 or 40 years. We have able and talented people, there's no doubt about that. We have a reasonably good environment for setting up new businesses in the sense of, registering your company in a relatively simple tax system. But the economics just doesn't work out. The interest rates are high, the exchange rate's high, these firms are typically more valuable to some investor overseas, and the opportunities gravitate away from New Zealand. And consistent with that, what we've seen New Zealanders doing for the last 50 years is leaving New Zealand. And so my argument is that policy has failed to respect the fundamental insight of New Zealanders. Who knows best what's going on in New Zealand but New Zealanders? New Zealanders, we've lost roughly 1 million people net in the last 40 to 50 years who've all said to themselves, the opportunities for myself or my kids or my grandchildren are better, particularly in Australia, than they are here. And yet despite that, it's gone on for decades. Successive governments have said, oh, no, we can't have this. We need to run policy to try and offset this. And that's been the explicit part of the policy to say, oh, New Zealanders are leaving, but we just need to substitute them out for some other people coming in. That's not how you build a cohesive society, among other things, but it's also not the way in which you build a strong economy. The analogy I use to people is look at Taihape. Taihape's population now, I think, is about half what it was 70 or 80 years ago. Just think what would have happened if governments had said, this is a terrible thing, we've got to send more people to Taihape. The opportunities just aren't there. Precisely. You drive down the average income and the average wage that's sustainable in Taihape. That is sort of the story that we've got for the economy as a whole, and it comes through that whole variety of channels: the interest rates, the exchange rates, the investment environment, and those natural resources that are now shed over 5 million people when probably they should have been spread over 3 million people.
Must make it clear, nothing against you, Taihape, you have great cafes and some amazing bungee jumping nearby. So I've also seen you talk about over the last decade where we've had this real spike of immigration running at about 2%, more than that target that we discussed before. But some of that has been New Zealanders returning. Yeah. And actually, the investment we've been able to put into our own economy, although we've been, investing as much as it feels like we've been able, we haven't actually been able to add to the real capital stock because of that population growth. So if you think we're trying to work smarter here, and part of working smarter is having more machines and more, more investment and capital around you to help you work smarter, we've been treading water just because of the sheer numbers of people coming in.
That's right, and so it's not that migration policy has changed in the last 7 or 8 years, but migration policy worked on the assumption that 25,000 New Zealanders a year were leaving, and instead that's drifted down to maybe 5,000 a year. And so, as Geoff says, the population's been growing 1.5% to 2% per annum. That's faster than anywhere else in the advanced world through this period. The total amount of investment that's been happening in this economy in the last decade has been only a bit above the lows that it reached during the 2008-2009 recession. And so much of that's had to be devoted simply to meeting the needs of the new people coming in, and not the capital deepening that Geoff's talking about. Firms adopting smarter, better, more capital-intensive ways of producing that enables them to support the higher wages. And consistent with that, the factoid that really should scare people in New Zealand is that we have had no productivity growth in New Zealand at all for the last 4 or 5 years. We've been bad for 70 or 80 years. We have these periodic episodes when it's particularly bad. This is one of them. So you listen to governments of both parties in the last 7 or 8 years that have said the economy's done quite well. Well, there's certainly been a lot of demand, there's been a lot of population growth, but the per capita income growth, the productivity growth just hasn't been there. And so when people complain about wage growth being flat in the last few years, it has been relatively subdued, but actually it's been a lot faster than the productivity growth. And in the end, in the long run, it's only productivity that supports improvements in material living standards. Without that, we can't get faster growth in wages, or indeed faster growth in public services and the things that people want, cancer treatments and so on.
Because if your productivity is not growing but your wages are growing, it's just a redistribution between the businesses and the workers, right? Which may not be a bad thing, but it can't go on forever.
No, indeed, and it acts as a further deterrent to business investment. And we are very, very short of business investment. And there's been a lot of sort of talk about things, smart interventions, the Provincial Growth Fund or R&D tax credits, but there's been very little in the way of questioning of why is it that firms are not investing in the first place, and a real reluctance, I think, to engage with these issues. And immigration, as Geoff says, as you all know, is a controversial issue. One of the reasons it's controversial is because there's a difference between an individual firm's perspective and the perspective of an entire economy. So, if you're at the bar downstairs and they probably have a bunch of people on working holiday visas, if they couldn't get somebody, an immigrant for that particular job, and the guy over the road could, they would be in a much worse situation. There's no doubt the individual firm would be worse off. But for the economy as a whole, you can't think about it at the level of the individual firm. An individual firm has to take everything else in the economy as given. For the economy as a whole, if we reduce the number of immigrants who are coming in, what we'd see is that our interest rates would be lower, our exchange rate would be lower, and a lot fewer resources would have to be devoted to building houses, roads, schools, and those sorts of things. And so Labour that's doing that sort of stuff at the moment, that's just rushing to just keep up with the rapid growth in the population, would shift over time to industries that were more outward oriented, more export oriented. There are some industries where it wouldn't work very well. My mother until recently was in a retirement village. Almost all the staff there were Filipino. Those retirement villages could not run on New Zealand labour alone because New Zealand labour would not work at those wages. So you take out immigrants there and there probably would have to be some more direct government spending. But that's not the case with most of the industries that we're talking about. So tourism, for example, relies a lot on migrant labour. Dairying relies a lot on migrant labour. But in this model, the exchange rate is a lot lower, and so returns to those exporters are higher. They're able to pay higher wages to attract the New Zealand staff. And this is not a radical proposition. You go back 40, 50 years, when my grandmother was in a retirement village, all the staff were New Zealanders. When my brother-in-law joined a dairy farm 30 years ago, all the staff were New Zealanders. New Zealanders will do these jobs if the wages are adequate. And that's part of the way in which wages improve in these sorts of sectors, is firms competing to get people into them.
So that brings us to one of the really interesting bits of evidence around immigration, and there's not a lot of New Zealand evidence on this. But broadly speaking, there aren't many studies which show that immigration reduces wages.
Across the board, that's right.
Across the board. So why should we be worried?
I think what's different, and this is where it's important to think about the specifics of the New Zealand economy. So my story is not an anti-migration story globally. If you're Belgium or France or Britain, centres of economic activity, it's quite probable that immigration is not doing it any particular economic harm at all. There might be some issues around, social adjustment and absorption, but those aren't my arguments. The really important thing to understand about New Zealand is just how remote we are. The line that came from, I think it was Alan Bollard when he was Secretary of the Treasury, what's New Zealand? It's the last bus stop before the Antarctic. Draw a circle 1,500 kilometres radius around New Zealand and you get 4 million people as it was then and an awful lot of seagulls. Draw a radius 1,500 kilometres around Amsterdam and you pick up 500 million people. World economies in the last 20 or 30 years have, if anything, become increasingly focused on closeness, the human interactions, the ability to work closely with your suppliers to build what are called value chains and supply chains. And when you're so far away as New Zealand is, it's very hard for those opportunities to arise. So my argument is that New Zealand, and to a lesser extent of Australia, have to be thought of as quite different sorts of economies than, say, a Belgium or France or Netherlands or Germany. And unfortunately, a lot of the advice that our policymakers have been getting has failed to take that difference seriously. So one of the leading economic agencies that advises government is the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. They're based in Paris. Almost all their advice to New Zealand is exactly the same as they would offer to Belgium or the Netherlands. And that's not surprising because that's where most of the staff come from. It's really hard to get your mind around the idea that distance matters, but it seems to have been becoming almost more important. Philip McKeown is a prominent New Zealand economist who's now based in the UK, and he did a presentation here in Wellington a few years ago that was pretty telling on this. He said, look, you all say that email makes a huge difference, and he says, and it does, but look, tell me, who did you email in the last 24 hours? And he ran through the sequence, how many people one kilometre away, how many people in the next office. Almost everyone was emailing mostly people in the same city or at least in the same country. A very small proportion of anybody's emails were people on the other side of the world.
It's interesting looking at the sort of data. the data that social media gives us around that too.
No,
because
absolutely. Yeah.
you can actually map social networks,
Right, yes.
and that's still very true.
Yeah. And it's true for businesses.
Or if you have international networks, it's because you were there once.
No, absolutely. And so, there's a lot of people in Wellington, people I know my age or a bit older, who, were involved in the reforms in New Zealand in the 80s, and they run little consulting businesses out of Wellington, and they can do it, but it's the connections that they built up when they were in those official positions. A friend of mine runs a foreign exchange advisory firm in Auckland, and as he says, he does it because he likes living in New Zealand, but he knows that if he based his business in Singapore or London, he'd make 50% more than he does. And it's just a small example of what we see globally. It's why those technology companies, you can build a tech firm in Wellington, Xero's done it, looks like they're even going to make money. But in the long run, most of those companies are going to be more valuable to people in Shanghai or San Francisco or Seoul or Brussels or London or Cambridge or anything of the sort than as remote as we are. And I think the comparison for New Zealand that's sort of relevant is to think about places like, Nebraska or Sicily, for example. Northern Italy is a really prosperous place for all Italy's problems. Northern Italy is really tied in with the value chains and supply chains that operate around Northern Europe. Sicily's really remote. Iceland's really remote by European standards. Tasmania does pretty badly by Australian standards. It's remote for them. Nebraska does pretty poorly. Montana in the US. We're really in much the same situation. This nice place to live, some decent governance policies and those sorts of things, but the economic opportunities for very many people just aren't here. And so the bottom line of my story is, look, probably if we hadn't geared up immigration again after World War II, if we'd just gone with natural increase from there, we might be a country now of 3 million people. With decent policies, I think there's no reason why a country of 3 million people here couldn't have prospered, couldn't have been up somewhere near that top tier of OECD countries as we were 100 years ago. But we've just made it ever harder for ourselves. Governments with this huge intervention. The scale of bringing 45,000 people a year in over 20 years that's 900,000 people roughly. So 20% of New Zealand's population is the result of the government direct intervention, the choice to bring people in. These are huge compared to the things that people worry about, whether they're health and safety policies or marginal changes in tax rates. They're really big interventions. They matter.
Surely though, there must be a skill level where you'd look at someone who turns up at our border and say, well, absolutely, we want you in the country. And if there were 45,000 of those, wouldn't we take them all?
I think if there were 45,000 of those, I'd consider it, but I mean, that's the hypothetical. We're nowhere near that. I think the more realistic question is, if there are 10,000 of those, we should welcome them and embrace them, and I would do that. I mean, I've argued for some time that instead of aiming for 45,000 people, we should aim for 10 to 15,000 a year. And
new residents to go back to the start of this
new non-New Zealanders.
Yeah.
They may have come in initially as students, they may have come in on work visas, but the right to stay and ultimately to become New Zealanders. And some proportion of that 15,000 would be the spouses of New Zealanders. New Zealanders go off to an OE, marry some Brit and come back here. But what you've got there is the 10,000 spaces for the people who are really able. Pull the standards up. Take a pretty open access approach to people with a PhD or maybe even a master's degree or something of the sort from the world's top 100 universities. But realistically, we're not going to be that attractive to that many of those people. Why? Because much as New Zealand's a nice place for us to live and a nice place for many foreigners to come to, if you're a hard-driving, entrepreneurial sort of person who's really wanting to build a business or is really ambitious, why would you come to New Zealand if you could go to the US or the UK or Canada or Australia? And so even some of the academics around New Zealand who are most strongly pro-migration will say, look, New Zealand is really only the fifth best choice for most people. There'll always be some people who will come because they've got family connections or they particularly like the skiing or the bushwalking and that sort of thing, but you're probably talking a couple of thousand. It would be a struggle to get even the 15,000.
You missed the lack of snakes.
No, well, there is that.
To Australia.
There is that real advantage.
I couldn't handle that.
No, well, me neither. But
I worked on immigration policy in the UK, and this was at a time under a Labour government where, very similar to what's happened with Brexit, the kind of pressure was coming on their immigration policy, and they wanted to introduce a points-based system and curtail immigration a bit to try and take that political pressure off. And we designed the system that it would come up with. And the quintessential problem that we faced, and the reason that in the end it all completely fell over, was because of, this is a very English reason, is because of Indian chefs. So chefs from India and Bangladesh and Pakistan who came in, and if you've ever been to the UK, their Indian restaurants are an absolute centre point of it. As much as fish and chip shops ever were, these Indian restaurants are a centre point of English culture. And we put forward these essentially what New Zealand has, a points-based system. The line was drawn above, because obviously to keep cheap Indian restaurants going, you need to allow people to come in to be paid, less than the average wage, as chefs or to run the restaurant, and that's the only reason they have such wonderful food that they can do so cheaply. None of the sons of the migrants or daughters of the migrants want to work in that industry, and why would they? They can go to university and get better jobs. So basically, our proposal was going to decimate the Indian and Pakistani restaurant industry in the UK, and it collapsed because this is such an integral part of English culture. Fascinating to then contrast that with, as you've been discussing, some of those Nordic countries who actually specifically have, they talk quite a lot about hospitality, as they don't, one of the reasons they restrict migration is because they want to, and if you've ever tried to get a coffee in Norway or Denmark or Finland or these sorts of places, you'll see that the costs are much, much higher than the rest of the world, because they really restrict that particularly that low end, lower skilled labour in hospitality. So the contrast between those two things, between those two countries, is quite stark. I guess the question that this brings in, and there's all sorts of complexities in this, but where do you draw the line? I mean, if you would take anyone above a certain level, where would that be? Do you have any off the top of your head thoughts on that, or?
I have got a model for work visas, because a work visa is part of the way through that you can bring people in to do the cheap Indian restaurant thing for 3 years at a time and cycle people through. And so I've run a policy argument that says, well, look, instead of having a bunch of bureaucrats deciding, you can bring in this worker and you can't, why don't we have a policy that simply says you pay a fee to the government over and above the salary, maybe $15,000 a year. If you're willing to pay $15,000 a year on top of the salary, you can bring people in. They can't stay permanently. You've got to reach those higher skill or qualification levels. But you can come here for 3 years at a time and you can cycle people through. And there'll be an endless supply, I'm sure, of people who will staff those Indian restaurants or whatever the New Zealand equivalent is.
The risk with that, having that endless cycle of people coming in for short stints, is that a proportion of them are going to fall in love with New Zealanders and marry and stay, but
yeah, that's right. And your aim in the whole thing is never to sort of close the doors completely. The aim is simply to have a sensible immigration policy, in my view, one that sort of coheres with what other sensible countries are doing. The UK, when they were trying to pull it back, they were pulling it back from something that was a third of our rates of immigration per capita. So if we could get down to those sorts of levels, we'd give ourselves a rather better chance. And any realistic immigration policy is going to be somewhat messy, because there's a variety of motivations. So if you look at that 45,000 a year target, it includes a couple of political quotas. The refugees, and probably all of us would want New Zealand to be, reasonably open to taking a reasonable number of refugees, whether that's more than we're taking now, but something around those orders of magnitude. There are ones that are there for avowedly political purposes. There are Samoan quotas and Pacific quotas. That's a reason why the Labour Party in particular is not able to tackle some of these issues. A lot of their base is those communities in South Auckland. But there are political and historical reasons why we have those quotas as well. And so this is not just one that you can sort of simply say, let's, a pure economist's argument would be, let's just auction the places and the person with the highest bidder will take them. This is not an economic exercise. In part, it's a society building exercise, and it's about societal priorities and balancing that range of imperatives, some of which do conflict.
Just before we open up for questions, I do have one last question / proposition to throw at you. I mean, my big concern with if you look at the way Switzerland does things, or even Australia with its New Zealand citizens, my big concern for where things might be headed now, and maybe you can answer this question in terms of where you think the current government is going to head with some proposals which will come out soon. But one big concern I have is that we might be headed down the road of Australia or Switzerland, which basically says, if you're working, you can stay here as long as you like, but you have no rights. Yeah. You're not a resident, and as soon as you lose that job, you're out. Yeah. We'll never give you access to benefits and that sort of stuff, which to me seems it's untenable in the long run. I mean, and it's unjust as well. I mean, if we're going to allow people to stay, we have to allow them ultimately to become part of our community and to become New Zealanders. And so you have to sort of work backwards in a sense from, what sort of society, what sort of economy do you want to build, and build pragmatic responses there. I mean, in a sense, that was what the national government was doing, and the changes that they made late in their term of saying, for these low-skilled people who do not qualify for residence, once they've been here for a certain period of time, they have to have a stand-down period back in whatever country they are, so that you're not setting up that sort of model permanently. As for what this government will do, well, who knows? I mean, they are due to come out with some announcements. They need to set the residence approvals target for the next few years, and they're apparently going to do that in the next few weeks. I would be surprised if they cut them or make material changes. They have tried to make some changes around work visas and study rights and those sorts of things. But broadly speaking, I mean, the Prime Minister has expressed herself as very strongly pro-migration. The business community, who the government in many respects has alienated, because of those individual firm perspectives, are very strongly committed to something like what we've got now. So I don't see any likelihood that we'll see any material change. And as I understand it, the National Party policy that was released today, despite my best efforts, doesn't show any signs of having adopted these mindsets either. So. Great. Okay. So any questions for Michael from around? Yes.
So my question really pertains to the universal basic income and how it relates to migration. If you talk about reducing the numbers so we're getting those high quality people, you're almost setting a bar, so you're saying we'd want you here because you're worth having a universal basic income like other New Zealanders, and then also how you think that relates to the strengthening of our rural economies, having a circular economy. Just how you think UBI would relate to the number of people we bring in.
Not sure. I mean, I'm fairly sceptical of the feasibility of a UBI, so that probably sort of colours the remarks. But I guess my main reflection would be that if you want a UBI that provides a good standard of living for people as a sort of basic, you need a high productivity economy, and the only way you're going to get that high productivity economy is to play to your strengths. And my fundamental message is that for the last 70 years we haven't been playing to our strengths. The big advantages that we had were access to the UK markets, some land, the dairy technology, refrigerated shipping. There's been nothing equivalent to that for the last 100 years, and yet we've brought in these people. So we've made things harder for ourselves, and we've pushed more people into the margins of poverty. Of course, there's a whole lot of other policies, housing and land reform and all those sorts of things that have contributed. So it doesn't answer your question very directly, but productivity covers over a lot of, solves a lot of problems.
That makes sense to me, that in terms of like our rural areas that we maybe we couldn't afford at the moment because of the route we've gone down, but how we transitioned to being highly productive so we could justify that. But I appreciate it's not just a a one-shot solution.
Yeah. And the climate change stuff fits in here as well. That, you know, I mean, as you all know, water quality has become an increasing issue in the last 20 years. Well, one of the reasons for that is that there's been so much pressure of a rapidly growing population to grow the export industries. And so, and the high exchange rate that I was talking about means that a lot of farmers haven't been making super amounts of money because they've been hard up against that. A lower exchange rate enables us to do more about taking a firmer line on agricultural emissions, about water pollution and so on. So there are, you know, real well-being issues there as well as the more directly economic ones that I'm focused on.
And yet I have heard you mention also before that obviously achieving reductions in climate, you know, in greenhouse gas emissions is much harder when we have such a strongly increasing population.
Well, absolutely, and I mean that's in a sense the point I'm making. That, but precisely because this, you know, we need to support ourselves. We all have a taste for imports, you know, our exports. We're not managing to grow that export base beyond the primary industries.
Yeah.
Is there much of a difference in terms of productivity levels between urban and rural areas?
Much less in New Zealand than there is in most countries, and that's actually one of the markers of how badly things have been going here. So that if you, and I'll explain why. Because if you go to, say, London as the extreme example, GDP per capita in London is roughly double that in the rest of the United Kingdom. And what that's telling you, I mean, it's partly telling you that finance is a really highly paid sector, but it's not that unusual. You go around the big cities in Europe, and it's the case in almost all those all those places. And what it's telling you is that those are economies that have been able to grow the high-tech industries, the service industries that rely on those people-to-people contacts and those close interactions. We haven't done that. In New Zealand, average GDP per capita in Auckland is something like only 15% higher than that of the national average. Wellington's actually a little bit higher than Auckland, but that's just because a bunch of highly paid public servants, and that's hard to measure productivity for public servants. But you know, what you'd have expected, given that our immigration policy has largely fed the really rapid growth in Auckland. Auckland's been probably the fastest growing, largest city in an OECD country. So let me get this straight. If you go through all the OECD countries and take their largest city and then look at how things have behaved since World War II, Auckland has grown faster than any of those other large cities. And almost all of that's been because of the rapid growth in immigration, because, you know, 50% or so of our net migrants settle in Auckland. And that's understandable and natural because it's the point of entry, it's where a lot of the diaspora communities already are. But the economic opportunities just don't seem to have been there. So in a way, it would be a good thing for New Zealand if incomes in Auckland were 50% higher than those in the rest of the country, so long as it was over time pulling up the rest of the country with it.
Yeah, I suppose from my background, I emigrated over from the UK to Hawke's Bay, and I don't live in Hawke's Bay because of a lack of economic opportunities. There's no work there 6 months of the year, and I suppose I look at UBI as a way to shore that up in some way so that you have money going into those regions, so you can actually have productive economies and share those value chains across the country.
But I mean, I'd tell you an alternative story, which is that if we didn't have such rapid migration and we didn't have the pressure on the interest rates and the exchange rate, the real exchange rate would be a lot lower in New Zealand. The one thing the regions are really missing out on in New Zealand is the competitive opportunities. If the real exchange rate were a whole lot lower, places like Dunedin and Nelson and the Hawke's Bay, a whole lot more industries would be viable there. Even natural resource-based industries, you know, more capital-intensive horticulture, for example, that just isn't now. So, you know, the two may be mutually complementary, but yeah.
Hi there. I was wondering what, if anything, gives you hope that New Zealand will eventually enact the sort of changes that you're talking about?
As I said, Cassandra, no, I mean, I tend towards the pessimistic. I mean, sadly, I fear that at some point the race and ethnicity issues may come to the fore in the New Zealand debate. And they're not my issues at all. I mean, I've repeatedly said to people, I don't care whether the migrants come from Birmingham or Bangalore or Buenos Aires, but a lot of people in our country will. And I suspect that if there's ever a real willingness to change policy dramatically, it will be because of that sort of upsurge and some sort of, quasi-Trumpian populist reaction. And that'll be a shame because those are sort of ugly sentiments, but it would also be a shame because it's not the foundation for good policy. I mean, you had this discussion here about what's a good a way to approach policy. Well, sometimes good policy comes out of bad events, but it's better for good policy to come out of good dialogue and good analysis and good research. But there's such strong... I'm hesitant to call them vested interests. There's so many people in the elites in New Zealand who are sort of committed to this sort of almost a globalist worldview that migration is good and more migration is better, and precisely because they're not willing to stand back and say, is New Zealand at all different from Brussels or Amsterdam? There's just been this real aversion to picking up the issue. I mean, I've been running, as Geoff said, these arguments now in one form or another for about 10 years. And there's various smart people around town who say, yeah, look, I think what you're saying is right, Michael. And there are actually more and more of them. But there's so much of a resistance, precisely, I think, for the concern that either you get tarred as racist for even mentioning the issue. And I've had a small amount of that. I can't really complain too much. And the other reason is that I think for people like us, middle-class professionals in New Zealand will probably always offer a reasonably good level of living standards. And a parallel I offer is with Uruguay. Uruguay 100 years ago was a relatively advanced country, and it spent 100 years going downhill. But if you look at the photos of the beaches in Montevideo, it looks like a really nice place. You can have a nice living standard if you're a professional middle-class person. It's the people at the bottom who are really missing out. It's the people who don't get the cancer treatments and can't afford it because they haven't got the private savings. Those people aren't legally disenfranchised, but it doesn't seem to me that their views are really represented by the policy or political elites in New Zealand.
Is it worth drawing out why, you've stated the case pretty clearly why the private sector is pro-immigration on a micro level. Yeah. But why is there such resistance at a government level, do you think, in terms of, it's the incentives for governments obviously are around keeping growth going. I mean, that's the big one that I see in terms of, and we really saw National in 2013 open the spigots to when there was a threat of a recession, just because more people means a bigger economy.
I think it's that, but I think probably more important is that distinction I was drawing earlier about the distinction between the sort of micro and the macro. So, if you're a National Party backbencher and you go back to your constituency at the weekend and you talk about lowering migration, all you'll hear from is this business, that business, and the other business saying, you can't do that, I can't operate without my migrant workers. And as I said, for the individual firm, that's quite right, they would be worse off without it. But it's really hard to get that macro perspective. And they're not getting it equally from their the bureaucracies, and I think some of this is about the degradation of the quality of the Treasury. I'm not saying that if Treasury was better, they'd necessarily have adopted my view, although I know that there are people there who've been sympathetic to it. But I think the other aspect of that maybe is the sort of almost ideological commitment that sort of still sees us as being like a Northern European economy, and that the same issues that arise, and that somehow to raise any doubts about immigration in a New Zealand context is to cast doubt on your bona fides as a sort of decent person and a sort of robust economist. It's not a very satisfying argument, but I don't think it's finality on anybody's part, but it's really hard to break out of a mindset. And Big New Zealand has been part of the New Zealand story really ever since the treaty, or at very least since Vogel. Vogel engaged in massive amounts of borrowing to rapidly grow New Zealand's population. As it happened, that turned out okay because we got refrigerated shipping and so on. But Vogel wasn't the first and he wasn't the last. And it's gone on through generation after generation of politician, National and Labour. It's a hard mindset to break out of when you've had it since 1840.
I'm just gonna, if you have questions, just put your hand up so Ben will bring you the microphone. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep firing because so there's on the one hand there is this, you put forward this theory that limited natural resources, that's our major source of wealth. Divide it by population, it's always going to get smaller if your population increases. The other argument I've heard, and I'd be interested to get your thought on, is that there's this view from a developmental economist, a theory in developmental economics, that the countries that developed did so usually because they had a labour shortage, and that forced them to start investing in other industries that were less labour intensive or becoming more capital intensive in the industries that they were already in. So that the classic example is comparing the development, for example, of European countries with what happened in Africa, for example, where Africa's always had more than enough labour to do anything that they've ever wanted, but European countries really started industrialising when they basically ran out of the ability to bring in more labour from the regions and put them to work in factories.
I'm not convinced by that story. I mean, I think, if anything, I would have read the story of Europe in the 19th century was one of sort of relative overpopulation, and so the dissipation of European populations through Latin America and North America and the colonies, and that's going hand in hand with the industrialisation at that time. But I mean, there may well be something to it that, if wage rates were high here, all else equal, that does encourage firms to invest more heavily in more capital-intensive production processes. The danger, of course, is that people then want to put the cart before the horse. You've still got to have the good productive opportunities here. And, we've been engaged in this business for such a long time now, 50, 60 years, looking to diversify the economy through a variety of different phases of wage inflation and even different phases of immigration, that I'd be hesitant about putting too much on that story. I mean, it would suit me too, obviously, but yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's fair enough.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
I'll ask one. So you've said that the sort of the internationally accepted story is perhaps not the same here as it would be in other countries, and you've also sort of hinted that it relies on the fact that New Zealand is more distant and less well connected to other populations than other countries. But I was wondering if you could just go into a little bit more detail about that. So how is this distance and lack of connection resulting in the immigrants who come here not adding to our productivity compared to in another country where an immigrant coming into that country could raise their productivity? What's behind that?
I think a lot of it is the way in which production processes, particularly in manufacturing in the last 20 or 30 years, have become increasingly reliant on these global value chains, products moving from one country to another, particularly around East Asia, but also around Europe. So countries in Eastern Europe, for example, Slovakia, Slovenia, the Czech Republic, that 30 years ago were really troubled communist countries, now have productivity levels that are as high as New Zealand's and are rapidly moving past us. Why? Because it's really easy to do car assembly in Slovakia and have the engine built in Germany and the dashboard built wherever, and to bring those bits and pieces together. The distances is just so short. It's easy for people controlling that process to get on a train from Frankfurt to Bratislava, an hour or two one way, and then you're back home in time for dinner. If you're coming to see an operation in New Zealand from San Francisco, it's just a long way to fly, and flying is no more attractive now than it was 50 years ago. The shipping distances, shipping costs aren't that large, but time is. And so just-in-time manufacturing, it's really hard for a firm to consider drawing on componentry from New Zealand when they could build that componentry in Malaysia, because Malaysia is that much closer to China or Japan or South Korea. And so those are some of the sort of key arguments, but it applies even in the service sectors. If you're London as global, so the European capital of finance, it's easy for somebody who's a specialist lawyer in some aspect of finance to talk to their clients in Frankfurt or Paris. you're in the same time zone, but more importantly, you're an hour away. We've just got that huge disadvantage of distance, and the things that historically we've been able to produce here are things that don't depend on that. They're relatively bulk commodities. And one of the ways that I back my story up is to actually look at Australia as well, and that Australia is much more profitable than we are, but in a sense Australia is only profitable because they've discovered a whole new wave of natural resources. So that if you look at the number of globally based businesses that are based in Australia, you'll find them on the fingers of one hand other than minerals and mining companies. So their relative prosperity in the face of relatively high immigration in the last 20 years is just that there's been a whole lot of LNG and coal that they've been able to develop and exploit. It's not because they've been able to develop those integrated parts of value chains or service industries as they have in London or Paris.
So I'm a little bit slow, so I'm just going to ask for a little bit more clarification. I hope that's all right. So
no, it's fine.
It seems to me that what you're saying is that if I'm in Bratislava, I can more easily and more profitably make a quarter of a finished product, because there'll be other firms and economies near me which will help to build the rest of that product and make it, get it to a consumer in the end.
Yep.
Whereas if we're in New Zealand, to do that is a much, much more difficult task. So we'd sort of have to have the whole thing in New Zealand or close by in order to make that process work?
Essentially that's the story. And so, one of the other arguments that people sometimes use is, well, what if we had 100 million people in New Zealand? And it's a bit of a straw man, because at any feasible rate of immigration, it would take us the rest of the century to get to 100 million people. But you'd still have that same problem that, even 100 million people in the middle of nowhere, 3.5 hours even from Sydney, it doesn't compare to the opportunities that are available right through from sort of Singapore to South Korea, or from Madrid through to Bratislava or Warsaw, or up into the Nordics.
I mean, there are people that do argue though that there's a threshold to those agglomeration effects, and that maybe if we could get Auckland to 3 million people, then we might start to see Auckland really starting to generate its own momentum.
To which my only response is, it's essentially the strategy that we've been trying for the last 50 years, and it hasn't worked yet. So, it's a huge double or quits bet, and there is no evidence and no compelling analysis that says that we will ever do that. So, you put 3 million people in Auckland, and still the opportunities are going to be better in San Francisco than they are here, because, realistically, San Francisco, already has those industries, it has top-notch universities, it has the centres of finance and those sorts of things. We risk much more over time becoming, a Buenos Aires or Santiago, reasonably prosperous places, but really not much more than middle-income countries. And that's my concern, is that we keep on this path, and that in 50 years' time, we won't be even just tagging on to the high-income countries, which is still where we are now. But there will be a Chile. Chile's done well, but Chile's not actually closing in on the rest of the OECD.
Yeah.
So, in response to your statement on supply chains for physical objects, the location of New Zealand is not ideal for that. But shifting into a digital economy where it doesn't exactly matter how far away you are, because bits and bytes travel at light speed, right, essentially. So, does that not give New Zealand a specific opportunity to invest in those industries to become more integrated in the global economy through things like web design, game design, even Weta being a good example of that, with their Weta Digital Studios being cutting edge in filmmaking. So do you see that being a frontier for New Zealand to invest in those industries?
I'd like to believe so. What makes me skeptical, I guess, is that the rise of digital economy and that sort of thing is not just starting now. It's been developing over the last 20 or so years. And yet, with the exception of probably, Weta, which relies heavily on the presence of the taxpayer subsidies for the industry, there aren't many of those cases. And as I was saying before, so many of those firms that have developed have ended up proving more profitable to owners based somewhere else. So, yeah, it looks superficially as though those disadvantages should be much less significant. It seems from the literature that part of what's going on there is that for a lot of those service industries, still the ability to talk to people, over a cup of coffee, or to have lunch, or to engage with team meetings and those sorts of things still matters. So you can contract out individual bits of it, but it doesn't look as though Melbourne or Auckland or Johannesburg or Santiago or Buenos Aires, some of those of which have really big labour cost advantages even relative to us, are managing to take advantage of those opportunities. So if it happened, it'd be wonderful. And so I've said on immigration always, look, wouldn't we be better to not put the cart before the horse? If we show that the opportunities are there and we find these firms growing, then it might be a good opportunity to say, hey, let's have some more migration. Let's bring people in to take advantage and maximise these opportunities and share out the gains. And that's more or less what happened in Ireland. Ireland for 100 years had people leaving to Britain and to the US. When they got their economy right, tax system, EU, whatever, and they started growing really strongly, only after they were already about as wealthy as the average European country did they really start seeing the immigration coming in. And that looks then to have been sort of mutually beneficial for those sorts of reasons. And so that to me would be the sort of agnostic view of things, saying, let's see the opportunities and then back it perhaps with migration, rather than punting on what's a really out there policy by world standards, which hasn't worked so far.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say, sorry, just, I'd say on that, and I kind of agree with where Michael's coming from on that, I do see that as a big opportunity for New Zealand. The question I think that Michael's raising is are we, I think we are seeing new firms pop up in that area. I think the question Michael's rightly asking is, are they going to stick around, or are they going to be like, V energy drinks and all of the other great companies that started in New Zealand and got sucked offshore. But regardless, bringing in people to stack shelves because they're called supermarket managers, and they meet a certain amount of points on a form, doesn't seem to me to add to that, to growing that particular industry. I can see what you are saying, but to me, that suits the more high-skilled end of the story that we're talking about, which I think we all agree we should be, allowing people to come in.
And the government's got an interesting thing on at the moment, the global impact visa trial, of sort of trying to attract some of those really able people who have ideas to take advantage of the opportunities in New Zealand. And to the extent that works, I think it's wonderful, but it's inevitably going to be on a small scale because there just aren't that many people in the world actually who have those sorts of talents and skills.
Yeah. Was it one last question? Did you have?
I was only interjecting a point about.
Let's get him a microphone. Interjections are welcome.
Yep. I had wanted to interject a quick point about companies like Weta, and that they get hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer subsidies.
Yep.
They employ thousands of people for a few weeks with no guarantee of long-term employment. They're not really a good employer,
right.
And it's not the kind of industries that I know they're very sexy and cool, but they're not actually a model for prosperity.
Right.
The other thing I want to say as well, if you're looking for a way to reduce or control the population that's going to be both, something that you can sell that's got to be politically tasteful, surely we have to go with the environment.
Yes.
Because it's the one thing that everybody accepts, it's the one compelling point that no big company can say publicly, I don't give a shit about the environment.
Yep.
They think it. I mean, the oil companies obviously think that. They don't care about the environment. But they can't come out and say it, and nobody is going to be able to counter the point that we have to control the population because the environmental damage and because we're trying to build a sustainable economy. We cannot do that when we've got massive population growth. No country can build a sustainable economy with this kind of population growth.
And yet,
nobody's really going to be able to fight back on that.
But unfortunately they have, right? And my best example is the Greens. I don't know whether you remember a couple of years ago, James Shaw actually gave quite a good speech where he raised...
But we know the Greens are not really an environmental party at all. They are very much a
fair comment, but he was
social agenda.
He was forced into humiliating himself and saying, we the Greens are basically a big population growth globalist party. I think you're right, and the environmental stuff is not my area of expertise, and so I don't tend to make it a big part of my story because I don't want to sort of look like I'm just running opportunistic arguments. But I think, for other people who want to pick up the argument, it is a significant element of the story. You have to be a little bit careful about it, though, because people do come back and they say, and I have a commenter on my blog who points this out virtually every single month. He says, look at Japan, they've got 120 million people in an area the size of New Zealand, and says, there are ways through the environmental thing. So you've got to make more nuanced arguments, I think, about the
Japan's not sustainable, though. They're overfishing, they're importing a huge amount of food. They had a nuclear disaster a few years ago.
There's one last question or comment down here, was it? No? Okay. I thought you wanted to say something about Weta, no? Or was it you? One last one.
I suppose it follows on from that environmental point and around the circular economy. I hear you talking, I'm starting to wonder, what can we do in New Zealand? We obviously aren't supposed to stay home. Is it not setting up these circular economies and increasing the value within our country, having these internal value chains, and if it results in exports, great, but actually being strong at home to potentially then allow us to be stronger on the world stage?
I think, if you look at the cross-country evidence, you'd find that basically any country that's ever achieved rapid growth and catch up on global productivity levels has almost always done it by exporting. And it's not because exports are superior to other things, it's just that that's the market test. It's a huge big market out there, and if you've got successful products, you'll find people both domestically and abroad who will want to buy it. I think an inward-looking economy in New Zealand is the path that we went through the 50s and 60s, and in a way it looked attractive at the time because New Zealand was starting out very prosperous, but it also meant that we had at one stage 22 television factories in New Zealand alone. Staggering statistic. We were making our own tennis rackets and all those sorts of things. There's just an incredible inefficiency because you're not taking advantage of the real benefits that there are from scale. I genuinely believe that if we are going to transform ourselves for the better, subject to all the environmental constraints, it's got to be by being as a sort of full participant in a successful global economy.
Just to finish up then with...
Can I get one more, sorry?
Oh, one more?
Yeah,
okay,
sorry.
Yep, go for it.
So, different sort of question now, but if one is looking to sort of promote policies that look to lower migration, how does one do it in a way that doesn't create a hostile environment for migrants and people from other backgrounds? What's your answer for that? How do we do this?
If I knew that, I'd be in Geoff's job, not an economic commentator. In a way, perhaps it needs partly a consistent record from the people who are advocating it, of being seen to be genuinely interested in the economics. And so even though I have views on a whole bunch of other things, I stay very clear of any of the sort of social cohesion arguments or any of those sorts of things around immigration. I just repeat my line, repeat it again and again. To some extent, maybe it needs people from ethnic minorities to be able to sort of buy into the rhetoric. And actually, even in the US, there's evidence that suggests that to the extent that wages are adversely affected by migration, it's actually the previous wave of migrants who are the most adversely affected. They're the people who the new migrants are often competing with for jobs. They're not competing mostly with you and me.
We did a similar study when I was, as I mentioned, working in the UK, and we found the people that were most anti-immigration were the most recent set of migrants for that exact reason.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
you're asking a political question of an economist, and we're notoriously bad at it. I mean, it is a challenge. It's got to come from probably a political leader who's regarded as unquestionably sound on these things, right? So that, think of Nixon to China, for example. Nixon, the hardline anti-communist, was the person who was able to establish diplomatic relations with China in the 70s. The person who could take on reducing immigration in New Zealand now. That's why I thought the opportunities were better with the Labour Party than they were with the National Party, precisely because the Labour Party historically was the party of workers and was the party of ethnic minorities, particularly the Pacific ones, and could be seen to be compellingly concerned about the interests of those groups in a way that historically National wasn't. I mean, if you guys can do it, that'd be great. But I mean, that's
yeah. And just to finish on a little anecdote talking about the environmental angle that you mentioned. I don't know if you remember a few years ago the snapper conversation came up in Auckland about reducing the snapper quota, and you get recreational fishers and commercial fishers at loggerheads about who's allowed to fish however many, and recreational fishers say, well, we're a tiny part of the catch, but in the Hauraki Gulf they're actually probably catching about half the amount of snapper up that way. And I remember going into one of these sessions with these people, going hard at the conversation and talking about how the other side was decimating the fish population. And I just asked the simple question, has anyone looked at the amount of, the increase in the amount of people fishing in the Hauraki Gulf over the last 20 years, given the growth of the size of Auckland, and people just hadn't looked at it from that angle before. So I think there is something to what you're saying in terms of having that, couching these things in an environmental sense. Because people really do see that New Zealand has an incredible asset with our environment, and it's once people start thinking about it, it's quite a simple idea to get across that more people is going to inevitably mean more environmental damage. So I think there is something to that. Thank you very much for your excellent questions, and please join me in thanking Michael Reddell. So if you've watched to the end, remember that we are going to do our brand relaunch. October the 3rd, we'll see you at McKeown in Wellington, or very soon splashed all over the internet. Cheers.